The storm of injustice. The city was alive with its usual hum, a mixture of honking cars, hurried footsteps, and muffled conversations. Yet for Maya, it felt like the world had narrowed into a dark, suffocating tunnel. She walked briskly along the damp streets, clutching her worn bag against her chest. The air was heavy with the promise of rain, and the faint smell of wet asphalt clung to everything around her. Shadows from the streetlights stretched long and distorted, as if mocking her every step. Her neck still throbbed from the accident, a hit and run that left her bruised and in a stiff brace. Despite her injuries, she had to go out that night. Her family's fridge was nearly empty, and her younger brother had been pleading for something other than bread and peanut butter. Maya had promised him a hot meal, and she was determined to keep her word. She had taken a detour through a quieter neighborhood, hoping to avoid the usual stares and whispers that followed her wherever she went. Her pace quickened as she approached the corner store. She adjusted her hoodie, pulling it tighter around her face, though it did little to shield her from the penetrating chill in the air, or the sharp pangs of fear gnawing at her. Maya had grown used to being judged by the color of her skin, her thrift store clothes, and the worn-out sneakers on her feet. But tonight, she hoped to slip through the cracks unnoticed. Then came the sound she dreaded most, a police siren, loud and piercing, shattering the relative quiet of the street. Maya froze mid-step, her heart racing like a trapped bird. She told herself to breathe. I haven't done anything wrong, she thought. There's no reason to be afraid. But her body betrayed her, trembling as the squad car pulled up alongside her. Hey you, barked a gruff male voice, slicing through the tense air like a knife. Maya turned slowly, her eyes locking onto two officers stepping out of the car. One was tall and broad-shouldered, with a hard, steely gaze that seemed to see right through her. His badge glinted under the streetlight, a cruel reminder of the authority he wielded. The other officer hung back, younger and less sure of himself, shifting his weight uneasily from one foot to the other. What's the rush? The older officer sneered, his tone dripping with mockery. Maya swallowed hard, trying to steady her voice. I'm just going home. Home, he repeated, his lips curling into a smirk. You don't look like you belong around here. What's in the bag? Maya instinctively hugged her bag tighter. It's just groceries, she said softly. The officer's smirk widened into a predatory grin. Groceries, huh? Let's see for ourselves. Before she could react, he snatched the bag from her hands. She reached out to stop him, but he shoved her back with a force that sent her stumbling. Her heel caught on the edge of the curb, and she nearly fell. Hey, Maya protested, but her voice sounded small and shaky against the officer's commanding presence. He tore open the bag, its contents spilling onto the wet pavement. A loaf of bread, a carton of eggs, and a few cans of soup rolled out, their meager appearance stark against the cold, gray street. He kicked at the eggs with the toe of his boot, crushing one, and sending the yellow yolk oozing across the ground. Looks like you've been busy, he sneered, holding up a couple of crumpled bills she had tucked into the side pocket. Is this your big haul for the night? That's for my family, Maya cried, her voice breaking. You have no right to treat me like this. The officer's grin faltered for a moment, replaced by a flash of something darker. No right, he repeated, stepping closer until his face was just inches from hers. You don't get to tell me what I can and can't do. Maya recoiled, her back pressed against the brick wall behind her. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The younger officer looked on, his eyes darting nervously between his partner and Maya. But he didn't intervene. What's that around your neck? The older officer asked suddenly, his gaze zeroing in on her brace. He reached out and grabbed it before she could move away. Don't, Maya screamed, clutching at his hand. But he yanked it off in one swift motion, ignoring her cry of pain. Her head snapped forward from the force, and she crumpled to the ground, clutching her neck in agony. The officer held the brace up like a trophy, his laughter echoing down the empty street. You're going to cry now, he mocked, tossing the brace onto the pavement beside her. "Don't see anything broken." Maya stared up at him, tears streaming down her face. Her body ached, but it was the humiliation that stung the most. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. The officer's smirk grew wider, feeding off her silence. "You should know your place," he said coldly. "Walking around like you own the place. People like you don't belong here." At that moment, a faint voice called out from the shadows. "What the hell are you doing?" Both officers turned to look, and Maya followed their gaze. A middle-aged man stood at the edge of the street, his phone held up as if recording the scene. His expression was a mix of disbelief and outrage. "Mind your own business," the older officer snapped, but there was a flicker of unease in his tone. The man didn't back down. "You can't treat people like that," he said firmly. "I've got this on camera." The officer's smirk faltered. He glanced back at Maya, his face tightening with frustration. "Get up," he barked, his voice losing some of its bravado. "We're done here." But Maya didn't move. She sat on the ground, her hands trembling as she cradled her neck. For the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her anger overpower her fear. She looked up at the officer, her voice steady despite the tears still streaming down her face. "You'll regret this," she said, her tone low but filled with resolve. "You don't even know who you're messing with." The officer froze, his sneer replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He didn't respond, but the silence between them spoke volumes. Maya stood slowly, brushing off the dirt from her clothes. She gathered the spilled groceries, her movements deliberate and defiant. The man with the phone stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the officers. "You'd better hope this doesn't go viral," he said, his voice laced with warning. The officers exchanged a tense glance before retreating to their car. The older one shot Maya a final glare before slamming the door shut. The squad car sped off, its siren silent, leaving Maya standing alone in the middle of the street. As she watched the car disappear into the distance, Maya felt a surge of determination rise within her. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And this time, she wasn't going to stay silent. The ripple effect. The night air was heavy as Maya stumbled into her small apartment, the door creaking behind her. Her mother, Leela, was sitting at the worn kitchen table, her fingers nervously knitting as a clock ticked on the wall. Her brother, Noah, was curled up on the couch, his little chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Maya leaned against the door for a moment, closing her eyes to fight back the sting of tears. "Maya." Leela's soft voice broke the silence. Her hands froze mid-knit, and she looked up, worry etched into her tired face. "What happened?" Maya hesitated, but when she saw her mother's concerned gaze, the words spilled out. She recounted every humiliating detail of her encounter with the police officer, the sneer, the torn neck brace, the spilled groceries. By the time she finished, her mother's hands were trembling. "I'm so sorry, baby," Leela whispered, standing to pull her daughter into a hug. "I thought this neighborhood would be safer." "It's not your fault," Maya replied, her voice shaking. "It's not about the neighborhood. It's about me. About how they see us." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Lila gently guided Maya to sit at the table and poured her a glass of water. "You have to report this," Leila said firmly, her voice tinged with both fear and determination. "He can't get away with what he did." Maya hesitated. She thought about the officer's smirk, his mocking laughter, and the crowd of people who had looked on but done nothing. Reporting him felt like yelling into a void, like shouting for help in a city that had already made up its mind about her. "What's the point?" Maya said finally, her voice small. "Even if I report him, nothing will change. People like him always win." Leela's eyes softened, and she placed a hand over Maya's. "You're stronger than you think," she said gently. "And this isn't just about you. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to someone else." Maya glanced at her little brother, still sleeping soundly on the couch. The thought of him one day facing the same humiliation made her stomach turn. She nodded, a spark of determination igniting within her. The next morning, Maya sat at her desk, her fingers hovering over the keyboard of her battered laptop. She decided to document everything in a detailed report. The officer's actions, his words, and even the man with the camera who had intervened. She knew it wasn't enough to rely on memory alone. She needed facts, evidence, and clarity. Hours passed as she typed, her mind replaying the encounter in agonizing detail. Every time she felt the sting of humiliation rise, she reminded herself of why she was doing this. This wasn't just about her dignity. It was about standing up to a system that thrived on silence. By midday, Maya had compiled everything into an email addressed to the local precinct's Internal Affairs Division. Her finger hovered over the send button, her heart pounding. She thought about all the stories she'd heard about complaints being buried, ignored, or dismissed. But she also thought about her mother's words, "You're stronger than you think." With a deep breath, she clicked send. Days turned into weeks, and life moved on, but Maya felt a strange tension brewing around her. It started small, a few curious glances from neighbors who usually ignored her. Then came the knock on her door late one evening. She opened it to find a man in his mid-40s wearing a suit, his expression grave but professional. "Miss Carter?" he asked, holding up a badge. "I'm Detective Mark Ellis with Internal Affairs. Do you have a moment to talk?" Maya nodded, letting him in. Her mother hovered protectively nearby as the detective took a seat at the kitchen table. He opened a notebook and pulled out a small recording device. "We've received your complaint," he began, "and I wanted to let you know we're taking it seriously." Maya raised an eyebrow, skepticism laced in her expression. "Seriously?" "Because I've heard about how these things usually go." Ellis nodded, his expression grim. "I understand your hesitation. But this case, it's already gaining attention. Someone posted a video of the incident online." Maya's eyes widened. "What video?" Ellis slid his phone across the table. The screen displayed a grainy video clip of her confrontation with the officer, taken from a distance. It showed everything. The officer tearing off her neck brace, spilling her groceries, and mocking her in front of the crowd. The video ended with her standing tall, her voice steady as she called him out. "It's gone viral," Ellis said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of comments. People are angry." Maya felt a mix of emotions, shock, fear, and a flicker of hope. "What does that mean for me?" she asked. "It means you're not alone in this," Ellis replied. "But it also means the spotlight is on you. Are you ready for that?" Maya thought about it. She thought about the humiliation, the fear, and the anger that had consumed her that night. Then she thought about the comments she hadn't seen but could imagine. People standing up for her, demanding justice. "I'm ready," she said finally. The following days were a whirlwind. News outlets picked up the story, reporters called nonstop, and Maya's face appeared on every social media platform. Some people hailed her as a hero, a symbol of resilience in the face of injustice. Others weren't so kind, questioning her motives or dismissing her as an attention seeker. Maya tried to focus on the positive. Messages of support poured in from around the world. Letters, emails, and videos from strangers who shared their own stories of injustice. For the first time, Maya felt like her voice mattered. But with the support came threats. Anonymous messages filled her inbox, warning her to drop the case or face consequences. Maya's mother insisted on keeping the windows locked and the curtains drawn, her anxiety growing with each passing day. "You don't have to do this," Leela said one evening, her voice trembling. "You can walk away. We can move somewhere else. Start fresh." Maya shook her head. "If I back down now, they win. And the next time it happens, it could be to someone who doesn't have the video, or a voice, or the courage to fight." Her words silenced her mother, who nodded reluctantly. Deep down, Leela knew Maya was right. This fight was bigger than them. One morning, as Maya was heading to her part-time job at a local bookstore, She noticed a car idling at the end of her street. It was unmarked, but the man inside was unmistakably a police officer. His eyes followed her as she walked, his presence a silent reminder that she was being watched. Maya felt a chill run down her spine, but she kept walking, her chin held high. She had no intention of letting fear dictate her actions. If they thought they could intimidate her into silence, they were wrong. When she reached the bookstore, her boss, a kind elderly man named Mr. Patel, greeted her with a warm smile. "You're becoming quite the celebrity," he joked, gesturing to the morning paper on the counter. Her story was splashed across the front page. Maya smiled weakly, her exhaustion showing. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No, but sometimes life chooses us for a reason," Mr. Patel said, his tone thoughtful. "You've already inspired so many. Don't lose sight of that." Maya nodded, his words resonating deeply. As she stocked shelves and helped customers, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had been silenced, overlooked, or mistreated. And she wasn't going to stop until justice was served. The fire within. Maya's life had turned into a whirlwind of interviews, social media posts, and meetings with lawyers and advocates. It felt surreal to be at the center of so much attention, but she was determined to channel it into something meaningful. The days that followed her decision to fight back blurred together, a mixture of empowerment and exhaustion. However, with each passing moment, the fire within her grew stronger. One crisp morning, Maya found herself standing outside a modest office building. The sign on the glass door read, "Justice Collective. Advocates for Equality." She hesitated for a moment, clutching the strap of her bag tightly. The building looked unassuming, but inside it held the promise of something she had craved for so long: support, guidance, and allies. She stepped inside, greeted by the faint hum of computers and the smell of freshly brewed coffee. A young receptionist with kind eyes looked up from her desk and smiled. "You must be Maya Carter," she said, her tone warm but professional. "That's me," Maya replied, her voice steady despite the nervous knot in her stomach. "They're expecting you," the receptionist said, gesturing toward a door down the hallway. "Third door on the right." Maya nodded and made her way down the hallway, the sound of her footsteps echoing off the polished floor. When she reached the door, she took a deep breath and pushed it open. Inside, a group of people sat around a large table. They were a diverse mix of ages, ethnicities, and professions, but they all had one thing in common: a fierce determination in their eyes. At the head of the table sat a woman in her late 40s with short cropped hair and an air of authority. "Maya," the woman said, standing to greet her. "I'm Victoria Hayes, director of the Justice Collective. We've been following your case closely, and I have to say, you've shown remarkable courage." "Thank you," Maya said, shaking Victoria's hand. "I'm just trying to do what's right." Victoria gestured for her to sit, and the meeting began. Over the next hour, they discussed Maya's case in detail: the video, the public response, and the steps they could take moving forward. Victoria's team included lawyers, activists, and media strategists, all of whom were eager to help. "This isn't just about one officer," Victoria said, her voice firm. "It's about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. Your case has the potential to shine a spotlight on that system and demand accountability." Maya listened intently, her resolve growing with every word. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't alone in this fight. As the weeks went on, the Justice Collective worked tirelessly to build Maya's case. They gathered testimonies, interviewed witnesses, and pored over legal documents. Maya threw herself into the process, attending every meeting, answering every question, and sharing her story with anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, the video of her encounter with the officer continued to circulate online, sparking heated debates. Some people praised Maya for her bravery, while others accused her of seeking attention or trying to ruin a man's career. The backlash was painful, but Maya refused to let it deter her. One night, as she was scrolling through her phone, she came across a message from a stranger. It was a woman named Carla who wrote about her own experience with police brutality. Carla's story was eerily similar to Maya's, but without the public outcry or video evidence, her case had been dismissed. "You're fighting for all of us," Carla wrote. "Thank you for not giving up." Maya stared at the message, tears welling in her eyes. It was a reminder of why she was doing this, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been silenced or ignored. She replied with a heartfelt thank you, vowing to keep going. As Maya's case gained momentum, the pressure on the police department intensified. Protests erupted outside the precinct, with people holding signs that read "Justice for Maya" and "End Police Brutality." The media swarmed the area, capturing every chant and every speech. Inside the precinct, tensions were running high. Officer Greg Mullins, the man who had assaulted Maya, sat in a cramped office, his face pale and drawn. The once confident smirk he had worn that night was nowhere to be seen. "You've really done it this time, Mullins," barked Captain Richards, slamming a folder onto the desk. "This isn't going away." Mullins fidgeted in his chair, his eyes darting around the room. "It's just a misunderstanding," he muttered. "She's blowing this out of proportion." Richards glared at him. "A misunderstanding? There's a video of you ripping off a girl's neck brace and mocking her in front of a crowd. How do you misunderstand that?" Mullins opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Richards shook his head in frustration. "You'd better hope Internal Affairs goes easy on you, because the public sure as hell won't." Meanwhile, Maya's fight was far from over. The Justice Collective had filed a formal complaint against Mullins and the police department, demanding not only disciplinary action, but also systemic reforms. They called for mandatory bias training, independent oversight, and greater accountability for officers who abused their power. The public response was overwhelming. Petitions garnered thousands of signatures, and community leaders voiced their support for Maya. Even local politicians began to take notice, eager to align themselves with a cause that was gaining national attention. But not everyone was on Maya's side. Threatening messages continued to flood her inbox, and she often felt the weight of the scrutiny bearing down on her. One evening, as she was leaving a meeting at the Justice Collective, she noticed a car following her. Her heart raced as she quickened her pace, glancing over her shoulder. The car slowed, its headlights casting long shadows on the pavement. Maya clenched her fists, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. Just as she was about to turn down a side street, the car stopped, and a man stepped out. He was tall and broad-shouldered, but his expression wasn't hostile. It was apologetic. "Maya," he said hesitantly, "can I talk to you?" She recognized him instantly. It was Officer David Young, the younger officer who had stood by silently during her encounter with Mullins. Her initial reaction was anger, but she forced herself to stay calm. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady but cold. I want to apologize," he said, his gaze dropping to the ground. "For not stepping in that night. I should have done something." Maya crossed her arms, skeptical. "Why now?" "Because you're scared of losing your job." Young shook his head. "No. I mean, yes, I am scared. But that's not why I'm here. I've been watching what you've been doing, and it's made me realize how wrong I was to stay silent. I let Mullins intimidate me, and I failed you." Maya studied him for a moment, searching his face for sincerity. She saw something there, regret, perhaps even shame, but she wasn't ready to forgive him. "Not yet. If you're serious about making things right," she said finally, "then testify against him. Tell the truth about what happened that night." Young hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. "I'll think about it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya nodded curtly and walked away, leaving him standing in the dim light of the street lamp. She didn't have time to dwell on his guilt or his excuses. There was still so much work to be done. That night, as Maya lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time. She had gone from being a faceless victim to the voice of a movement. It was a heavy burden to carry, but she knew she wasn't carrying it alone. The fire within her burned brighter than ever, fueled by the stories of those who had been silenced and the hope of a better future. She didn't know what the next day would bring, but one thing was certain: she wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. The burden of justice. The protests outside the police precinct showed no signs of slowing. What had started as a small gathering of supporters had grown into a massive, citywide movement. People from all walks of life had joined, their voices united in demanding justice. The chants echoed through the streets, spilling into nearby neighborhoods and beyond. Justice for Maya. End police brutality. The signs they carried were as varied as the crowd itself. Bold declarations of accountability, pleas for change, and personal stories scrawled in thick black ink. Maya had never seen anything like it. From the safety of her apartment window, she watched the throngs of people moving as one, their determination lighting up the cold, gray streets. But with the support came a mounting sense of pressure. The Justice Collective had arranged for Maya to speak at the next rally, urging her to share her story directly with the crowd. They believed it would galvanize the movement even further, turning her into a symbol of hope and resistance. Maya, however, wasn't so sure. What if I freeze? She confided to Victoria Hayes during a strategy meeting. What if I mess up and say the wrong thing? Victoria leaned forward, her sharp eyes softening. Maya, you've already said more than enough just by standing your ground. The people out there aren't looking for perfection. They're looking for authenticity. Just be yourself. Maya nodded, but the knot in her stomach refused to loosen. Speaking in front of cameras was one thing. Speaking in front of thousands of people, that was something else entirely. The night before the rally, Maya sat in her room, staring at a blank piece of paper. She had tried writing a speech earlier in the day but had torn it to shreds in frustration. Nothing felt right. The words on the page couldn't capture the weight of her emotions or the enormity of the situation. A soft knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. It was her mother, holding a steaming cup of tea. "You're still up?" Leela asked, sitting beside her on the bed. Maya sighed, rubbing her temples. "I can't figure out what to say. Everything feels inadequate." Leela placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Speak from the heart," she said simply. "You've been carrying this burden for so long, Maya. Let them know what it feels like. Let them see the world through your eyes." Her mother's words stayed with her long after the tea had gone cold. That night, Maya finally put pen to paper, letting the words flow freely, unfiltered and raw. The day of the rally arrived with an electric energy in the air. The streets surrounding City Hall were packed with people, their cheers and chants reverberating through the towering buildings. A makeshift stage had been set up at the center of the square, flanked by towering speakers and a sea of microphones. Maya stood behind the stage, clutching her speech in trembling hands. Victoria was beside her, offering quiet words of encouragement, but Maya barely heard them. Her heartbeat drowned out everything else. When her name was announced, the crowd erupted into applause. Maya felt her legs turn to jelly as she stepped onto the stage. The sheer number of faces staring back at her was overwhelming, a sea of humanity stretching as far as she could see. She took a deep breath, her fingers gripping the edge of the podium. The microphone crackled as she leaned forward, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. "Thank you," she began, her voice steady despite the nerves coursing through her. "Thank you for being here, for standing with me, and for believing that we can create a better future." The crowd cheered, and Maya felt a flicker of confidence ignite within her. "When I walked home that night," she continued, her voice gaining strength, "I was filled with anger and humiliation, but I was also filled with questions. Why did that officer think he could treat me like I didn't matter? Why did the people who saw what happened look away? And why, In a city that claims to value justice, does injustice feel so commonplace? Her words struck a chord, rippling through the crowd like waves. People nodded, clapped, and shouted their agreement. "I don't have all the answers," Maya admitted, her tone softening. "But I do know this. Change doesn't happen in silence. Change happens when we speak up, when we stand together, and when we refuse to accept the status quo." The crowd roared, their energy lifting her higher. "My story is just one of many," she continued. "There are countless others who have faced the same pain, the same humiliation, but didn't have a camera there to capture it. They deserve justice too, and we owe it to them to keep fighting." Tears pricked the corners of her eyes, but she held her head high. This fight isn't just about one officer or one incident. It's about dismantling a system that thrives on inequality. It's about demanding accountability, fairness, and respect for everyone. The applause was deafening now, a thunderous wave of support that washed over her. "Together," Maya concluded, her voice ringing with determination, "we can build a world where no one has to live in fear of those who are supposed to protect them. A world where justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." As she stepped back from the podium, the crowd erupted into cheers, chanting her name over and over. Maya felt a rush of emotions: pride, relief, and an overwhelming sense of purpose. She had done it. She had found her voice. In the days that followed the rally, the momentum only grew. News outlets replayed clips of Maya's speech, and hashtags like #JusticeForMaya and #EndPolicebrutality trended worldwide. Petitions demanding systemic reforms reached record-breaking numbers, and more stories of injustice began to surface. But not everyone celebrated her success. The threats continued, growing more frequent and more aggressive. One night, as Maya was scrolling through her email, she came across a message that made her blood run cold. "You think you're safe, but you're not. Drop the case, or you'll regret it." She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. She knew the risks of speaking out, but the reality of those risks was now impossible to ignore. "I'm not backing down," she said aloud, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. Meanwhile, Officer Mullen's world was unraveling. The Internal Affairs investigation had unearthed a troubling history of complaints against him, many of which had been quietly dismissed. Public pressure was mounting, and even his own colleagues were beginning to distance themselves. For the first time in his career, Mullins felt powerless. One afternoon, as he sat in the precinct's break room, his partner, Officer Young, approached him. There was a tension in Young's posture, a weight he seemed ready to unload. "We need to talk," Young said, his voice low. Mullins glared at him. "About what?" "About what happened that night," Young replied, his tone firm. "I can't stay silent anymore." Mullins' face darkened. "You're really going to turn on me?" Young met his gaze, unflinching. "I should have done something that night. But I didn't, and I regret it every day. Maya deserves the truth. The people deserve the truth." Mullins' jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Young's words hung in the air like a challenge, one that Mullins wasn't ready to face. As the investigation continued, Maya found herself at the center of a storm she could never have imagined. The burden of justice was heavy, but she carried it with unwavering resolve. She had come too far to turn back now, and she was ready to see it through to the end. The walls began to crumble. The days following Maya's speech at the rally were a blur of activity. Her name was on every news outlet, and her words echoed through social media like a battle cry. But with the attention came an even greater onslaught of pressure. Journalists camped outside her apartment building, waiting to catch a glimpse of her. Activists flooded her inbox with messages of support, while detractors sent threats laced with venom. The Justice Collective's office became a second home for Maya. She was there almost every day, working with Victoria Hayes and the team to build not only her case against Officer Mullins, but also a broader campaign for systemic reform. Their goal was clear: to expose the cracks in the system and demand accountability from those who had allowed these injustices to persist. One morning, Maya sat across from Victoria in a small conference room, the table between them covered in stacks of papers, files, and notes. Victoria had just finished briefing her on the latest updates in the case. The internal affairs investigation had revealed that Mullins had been the subject of multiple complaints over the years, all of which had been quietly swept under the rug. "This isn't just about Mullins," Victoria said, her voice tinged with frustration. "It's about a culture of complicity. He didn't act like this in a vacuum. He did it because he knew he could get away with it." Maya nodded, her jaw tightening. "So what do we do?" "We turn up the heat," Victoria replied. "The department is already feeling the pressure from the public. If we can keep the spotlight on them, they'll have no choice but to act." Maya's phone buzzed on the table, drawing her attention. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from an unknown number. "I know what you're doing, and I can help. Meet me at Maple Cafe tonight. 7 p.m. Come alone." Maya frowned, her mind racing with questions. Who was this? And what did they mean by help? She showed the message to Victoria, who read it carefully. It could be a trap, Victoria warned, or it could be someone with valuable information. Maya hesitated. The idea of meeting a stranger alone was unsettling, but if there was even a chance this person could help, she couldn't ignore it. "I'll be careful," she said finally, "but I have to find out what they know." Victoria nodded reluctantly. "Fine, but take this." She slid a small recording device across the table. "If things go south, at least we'll have a record." That evening, Maya arrived at Maple Cafe, a cozy little spot tucked away on a quiet street. The warm glow of the lights and the soft hum of jazz music inside created an atmosphere of calm, but Maya's nerves were anything but. She scanned the room, her eyes landing on a man sitting alone at a corner table. He was in his late 30s, with sharp features and an air of quiet intensity. As she approached, he looked up and gave a small nod. "You must be Maya," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm Detective Alan Rivera." Maya's eyes widened in recognition. She had seen his name mentioned in articles about the police department. Rivera was known as a straight shooter, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the status quo. "What do you want?" Maya asked, sitting across from him. "I want to help you," Rivera replied. "But first, I need you to know what you're up against." Maya leaned in, her curiosity piqued. "Go on." Rivera took a deep breath. "Mullins isn't the only problem. The entire department has a history of covering for officers like him. They bury complaints, intimidate witnesses, and protect their own at all costs. If you keep pushing, they're going to come after you." Maya's stomach tightened, but she refused to show fear. "I already know they're watching me. That's not going to stop me." Rivera nodded, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Good, because if you want to win this, you need to expose the whole system. And I can give you the evidence to do it." He pulled a small flash drive from his pocket and placed it on the table. "This contains internal emails, case files, and other documents that show how the department has been covering up misconduct for years. It's not enough to take down the entire department, but it's a start." Maya stared at the flash drive, her mind racing. This could be the breakthrough she needed, but it also came with risks. If the department found out Rivera had leaked this information, he could lose his job, or worse. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Rivera's expression hardened. "Because I'm tired of watching good people get destroyed by a corrupt system, and because I believe in what you're doing." Maya studied him for a moment before reaching for the flash drive. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Be careful," Rivera warned. "They won't go down without a fight." Back at the Justice Collective, Maya handed the flash drive to Victoria and the team. They spent hours combing through its contents, uncovering a trove of damning evidence. The documents revealed a pattern of misconduct and cover-ups that stretched back years. Complaints against officers were routinely dismissed, and whistleblowers were silenced through intimidation or reassignment. "This is huge," Victoria said, her voice filled with awe and anger. "If we release this, it could blow the lid off the entire department." Maya nodded, but her mind was already racing with the implications. This wasn't just about Mullins anymore. It was about exposing a system that had enabled him and countless others like him. The next morning, the Justice Collective held a press conference to share their findings. The room was packed with journalists, activists, and community leaders. Maya stood at the podium, flanked by Victoria and the rest of the team. "The documents we've uncovered paint a clear picture," Maya began, her voice steady and resolute. "This is not about one bad officer. This is about a system that has prioritized protecting its own over protecting the people it's supposed to serve." She held up a copy of one of the leaked emails, her gaze sweeping the room. "This email shows how complaints against Officer Mullins were deliberately dismissed, despite clear evidence of misconduct. And he's not the only one. This pattern has been repeated over and over, creating a culture of impunity." The room erupted with questions, but Maya held up a hand to silence them. "This is just the beginning. We are demanding a full, independent investigation into the police department and its practices, and we won't stop until justice is served." As she stepped away from the podium, the crowd erupted into applause. Maya felt a surge of pride and determination. The walls of the system were beginning to crumble, and she was ready to see them fall. But as the movement gained momentum, so did the threats. Anonymous calls, ominous notes slipped under her door, and unmarked cars lingering outside her apartment became a constant presence. Maya knew the stakes were higher than ever, but she refused to back down. "This is what they want," Victoria reminded her one evening. "They want you to feel isolated and afraid. But you're not alone, Maya. We're in this together." Maya nodded, her resolve unshaken. She had come too far to turn back now. The truth was out, and there was no putting it back in the shadows. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Maya felt like victory was within reach, and she was ready to face whatever came next. A reckoning with justice. The city was restless, its streets alive with tension. Protests had swelled to unprecedented numbers, and the growing cries for justice reverberated through every corner of the community. The truth about Officer Mullins and the police department's systemic corruption had sparked outrage, and Maya found herself at the heart of a movement larger than anything she could have imagined. But with the momentum came darker forces. The threats against Maya escalated. One morning, she found her apartment door ajar, the lock twisted, as if someone had forced their way in. Inside, drawers had been ransacked, papers strewn across the floor. Her laptop was untouched, but its screen displayed a single, ominous message: "Stop now, or you'll regret it." Maya stood frozen, her heart pounding. Whoever had done this wanted her to know they could reach her anytime. She called the Justice Collective immediately, and within the hour, Victoria Hayes and Detective Rivera arrived. "This is a clear intimidation tactic," Rivera said, inspecting the damage. "But it also means they're scared." "Scared or desperate," Maya replied, her voice steadier than she felt. Victoria placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You're not alone in this, Maya. We'll increase security, but we won't let them silence you." Maya nodded, her resolve hardening. "Let's keep going. We're too close to stop now." The evidence from the flash drive was enough to trigger a federal investigation into the police department. A special task force was formed, and subpoenas were issued to high-ranking officials. The department's leadership, once confident in their ability to shield themselves, began to unravel under the weight of scrutiny. Officer Mullins was suspended without pay, pending a formal hearing, but the investigation didn't stop there. Detectives unearthed a disturbing web of cover-ups, falsified reports, and coerced witnesses. The revelations shook the city to its core, and the media covered every development with relentless fervor. For Maya, the fight became increasingly personal. She received dozens of letters and messages from people who had suffered similar abuses but had never found the courage to speak out. Each story fueled her determination, reminding her that this battle wasn't just hers, it was for everyone who had been silenced. One rainy evening, Maya found herself sitting in a dimly lit conference room at the Justice Collective. Rivera had called an urgent meeting, saying he had information that could tip the scales. "I've been digging into Mullins' records," Rivera began, his tone grave. "There's more to this than we thought." He slid a folder across the table, its contents spilling out: photographs, emails, and transcripts of internal communications. Maya picked up one of the photos, her eyes widening as she recognized a familiar face. "This is the young officer who was with Mullins that night," she said. "David Young." Rivera nodded. "He's been on administrative leave since the investigation started, but he's reached out to me. He's willing to testify against Mullins." Maya's breath caught. Young had been a silent witness to her ordeal, his inaction a source of lingering resentment. But his testimony could be a game-changer. "Why now?" she asked, her voice tinged with skepticism. Rivera hesitated. "He says he regrets not stepping in, and he's terrified of what will happen if this corruption isn't stopped. He wants to make it right." Victoria leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "If he's sincere, his testimony could solidify our case. But we'll need to ensure he's protected. Testifying against your own department is dangerous." Maya nodded, her emotions a mix of hope and caution. "If he's willing to stand up for the truth, I'll support him." The day of the hearing arrived, and the courthouse was surrounded by protesters and reporters. The atmosphere was electric, charged with anticipation and a sense of impending justice. Maya entered the courtroom with Victoria by her side, her head held high despite the weight of the moment. Officer Mullins sat at the defense table, his once confident demeanor replaced by a tense, guarded expression. His lawyer whispered in his ear, but Mullins barely seemed to register the words. When David Young took the stand, the room fell silent. He looked nervous but determined as he raised his right hand and swore to tell the truth. "I was there that night," Young began, his voice steady despite the tension in the room. "I saw everything. And I stayed silent because I was afraid of what speaking out might cost me." He paused, his gaze shifting to Maya. "But what I witnessed was wrong. Officer Mullins' actions were not only unprofessional, they were cruel and unjustified, and I regret not doing anything to stop him." The prosecutor pressed him for details, and Young recounted the events with startling clarity. His testimony was damning, painting a picture of an officer who had abused his power without fear of consequences. Mullins' lawyer attempted to discredit Young, suggesting he was testifying to save his own career. But Young remained resolute, refusing to waver under cross-examination. As the hearing progressed, more evidence came to light: emails, recordings, and testimonies from other witnesses. Each piece added to the growing case against Mullins and the corrupt practices of the department. By the end of the proceedings, it was clear that the tide had turned. The judge announced that Mullins would face criminal charges, and the federal investigation into the department would continue. The courtroom erupted into applause, and Maya felt a surge of relief and vindication. Outside, the crowd cheered as Maya stepped onto the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed, and microphones were thrust toward her, but she ignored them, addressing the sea of supporters directly. "This victory is not just mine," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It belongs to everyone who has ever been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. It belongs to the people who refuse to accept injustice as the norm." The crowd roared in agreement, their chants of "justice for Maya" echoing through the streets. In the weeks that followed, the city began to change. The police department underwent sweeping reforms, including the implementation of independent oversight and mandatory bias training. Officers who had engaged in misconduct were held accountable, and new leadership was brought in to restore trust. Maya's life also transformed. She became a prominent advocate for justice, using her platform to amplify the voices of others. She spoke at conferences, collaborated with activists, and continued to push for systemic change. But despite her newfound prominence, Maya remained grounded. She never forgot the fear and pain she had felt that night, nor the courage it had taken to fight back. Her journey was far from over, but she faced the future with unwavering determination. One evening, as she stood on her apartment balcony, looking out at the city that had once seemed so cold and indifferent, she felt a sense of quiet triumph. The fire within her still burned, brighter than ever. And she knew, without a doubt, that the fight for justice was worth every step.